Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about primary productivity, and this corresponds with Module 6 in your textbook. Again, make sure to pause the video and take good notes and rewatch any sections that might be a little bit confusing as we go along. And I also recommend spending a little bit of time checking out Module 6 in the textbook because it does do a good job of explaining this information as well. So primary productivity is the rate at which solar energy is converted into organic compounds via photosynthesis over a unit of time. Basically, it is a measure of how much photosynthesis is taking place. So how fast are the producers or the plants or the algae doing photosynthesis, and how much is being produced and how fast. So productivity, if we break that term down just a little bit more, is measured in units of energy per unit area per unit time. That gets these really big units attached to numbers, such as kilocalories per meter squared per year. You might also see this as being written as biomass added per unit area per unit time, and that would be in grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And remember, anytime you see time involved, you're looking at a rate. Gross primary productivity is a way to measure or talk about the total amount of photosynthesis that is taking place in a given area. But that's not the only measure of primary productivity that we care about. So gross is just looking at everything. Net primary productivity is the rate of energy that's being stored in that particular plant after subtracting out the energy that's lost during cellular respiration. Remember, plants do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. But why do we care about this? Well, this is because not all of the gross primary productivity actually goes into making biomass. So not all of the energy that's collected by the plant is used to make the plant bigger or make more of those kinds of plants. Some of that productivity is used for life processes, which would be respiration, things to keep that plant or that organism alive. And ultimately, that energy that's used in respiration is lost as heat. So you're going to have to be able to calculate net primary productivity and gross primary productivity. And it's really not that hard. We use simple subtraction. So net primary productivity is equal to gross primary productivity minus respiration. You do need to know this calculation. So brief review here. Gross primary productivity, the total amount of photosynthesis that's happening. So the total amount of energy that's captured and converted into glucose. Now remember, all plants are using some of that glucose to do cellular respiration, to do their normal life processes. So the net primary productivity, or NPP, that's the amount of energy that is able to be made into that new biomass or the new plant tissue. And R represents respiration, so the energy that's used to keep the plant alive. You are going to need to be able to do these calculations, and you are not ever going to be given the formula for calculating net primary productivity and gross primary productivity. It's not a hard calculation. You can see it's NPP equals GPP minus R. It's just subtraction. You should be okay. So our example here, in a forest in North America, the gross primary productivity is 2.5 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. Approximately 1.5 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year is lost through respiration in plants. So given this information, what is the net primary productivity of this ecosystem? Well, we always start with our formula, NPP equals GPP minus R, and we plug in our numbers. So NPP equals 2.5 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year minus 1.5 kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. Make sure that you always are attaching units to your numbers, so no naked numbers. Every time you write a number, tell me what that number is representing, so put a unit right next to it. Now you can plug this in a calculator, or you can do the subtraction in your head, so 2.5 minus 1.5 should be pretty simple, which gives you 1 kilogram of carbon per meter squared per year. What does this mean? This means that The plants that are living in 1 meter squared of forest are adding 1 kilogram of carbon to their tissues every year by means of growth and reproduction. That's what it means. That's it. But there are many factors that affect primary productivity, and these are factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. These are things like the amount of solar radiation. So how bright, how dark is that particular location? Things like temperature. Is it really hot? Is it really cold? Well, if you're at any extreme for solar radiation or temperature, probably not going to have a whole heck of a lot of photosynthesis going on. But if you're in that happy zone where optimum photosynthesis takes place, you're going to have a lot of primary productivity. Same thing with the amount of carbon dioxide and water. Those are 2 inputs that go into the photosynthesis equation. So it makes sense that they affect the overall rate of primary productivity. Nutrients also impact the rate of primary productivity. So remember in our discussion about eutrophication, which is when you have excess nutrients that flow into a waterway, that is no longer limiting the growth of algae. So algae grow really, really fast, and that leads to some interesting consequences within that ecosystem. So normally nutrients are limiting how much growth there is, and if you have too many nutrients, you can have an extra abundance of growth. Or if you don't have very many nutrients, you really don't have much growth going on. Herbivory also impacts the rate of primary productivity. Herbivory is just animals eating plants, so herbivores eating plants. This affects the rate of primary productivity because if the plants are constantly being grazed and constantly being eaten, they're not able to really grow and add that biomass to their tissues. So what does this mean for ecosystems? Well, the ecosystems are ranked here in this diagram with the most productivity at the top and the least at the bottom, separating out terrestrial from aquatic. And the least productive ecosystems are the ones with the most limitations. So that it's either way too hot, way too cold, not enough light, not very much water, not very much nutrients. And if we think of the places in the world that have these limitations, those are places like the tundra and the desert. If we think of places that are generally warm, have lots of light, lots of water, lots of nutrients, those are things like tropical rainforest or the temperate forest or the tropical seasonal forest. These are places that have a ton of plant growth and a ton of productivity. Now, if we look at productivity in marine ecosystems, they're primarily limited by light. And this little factoid at the beginning here, algae and phytoplankton are located near the surface of the ocean and produce approximately 40% of the oxygen on Earth. That little factoid comes up in the College Board course exam description quite a bit, and it's an important little nugget of trivia that you need to know, is that most of the oxygen on Earth does not necessarily come from the land plants. 40% of this oxygen on Earth actually comes from the algae and phytoplankton in the ocean. So that's why it's really important to protect our oceans. But why are these algae and phytoplankton found primarily near the surface of the ocean? Well, that has mostly to do with sunlight. So visible light penetrates through the water column of the ocean. So remember, light comes from the sun, it hits the surface of the water. Now, every time the sunlight hits a molecule of water or hits a particle in the water, the light gets scattered a little bit. And if you have more turbidity, so more particles in the water, there's going to be more scattering of that light. So the light, instead of going straight down, gets sent in all sorts of different directions, and it doesn't go as deep into the water column. That is why the coastal waters are only going to have the sunlight penetrate to about 50 meters of depth. Now, out in the open ocean, there's typically less turbidity. There's not as much sediment moving around out there. So the sunlight can penetrate much deeper into the water column. But you'll notice that even in the open ocean, the sunlight only makes it to about 200 meters deep. So that means that the organisms that live deeper than that in the ocean, they need to find some other way to get their energy, because all of the energy on Earth pretty much ultimately comes from the sun. Now, also, if you look at the diagram showing the open ocean, you'll notice some wavelengths of light move deeper into the water than others. If you've ever gone scuba diving and you've had the opportunity to do a deep dive, you'll notice that colors start to look just a little bit different. You lose that red wavelength of light pretty quickly. So if you do a deep dive of only about 50 feet to 70 feet deep, you're going to notice that colors already just look a little bit off. And the deeper you go, the more blue and green that you'll see and the less reds and yellows. So kind of fun little nugget of information. Now, in summary, primary productivity is the rate at which sunlight is converted into organic compounds. Basically, it's measuring how much photosynthesis is happening in a unit area for a specific unit of time. And we can calculate productivity using the NPP equals GPP minus R. Again, if you have not written that down yet, make sure you write down that equation because, again, for whatever reason in AP Environmental Science, you do not get a list of calculations to use on the AP exam, and therefore I do not give you a list of calculations on any of the assessments in this class, just to help force you to start memorizing this right away. Also, the amount of sunlight is a major factor that influences the amount of productivity in an ecosystem. So this is limiting in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, particularly if you look at how deep in the water column an organism lives, they're going to have less sunlight, and that influences how much productivity is right there. Now, I know I went through a lot of information and I went very fast through this, so please send me your comments and questions on this so I can get back to you as soon as possible. Make sure that you took good notes, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.